When I was a toddler, so like 3-ish, one of the movies I watched probably more often than many others was the classic Disney animated Cinderella. I don't know how many times I watched it. And one day I noticed something that my 3-year-old self felt was missing from this movie. So I turned to my mother and I said, "Mommy, how come Cinderella never goes to the bathroom?" As a toddler, I wanted to see her not only as the hero of the story, but to see her doing the human being things that I was learning to do, and that I was being told that all human beings would do. And so I wondered, if I never see Cinderella go to the bathroom or brush her teeth, why isn't she doing those things that she's supposed to do to take care of herself? She doesn't feel like she's supposed to? Maybe her evil stepsisters and stepmother won't let her? My mother said that she did. It just wasn't relevant to the story. That's just not how movies worked. I have to say, I appreciate that our Torah doesn't take quite the same approach as Disney as far as what gets included or excluded from a story. It gives us at least a little bit of the mundane bits of our ancestors' lives, of them figuring out how to be human beings. We get to see how they figured it out so that we can also figure out how to be human beings. In the Torah, we see them have family squabbles, we see them whine, we see them complain, we see them rebel, we see them yell at each other, we see them work, love, and find food sometimes. Disney didn't tell me when Cinderella needed to brush her teeth because they didn't find it relevant, but the Torah finds those moments relevant, which means the Torah is giving us opportunities to learn, even from those mundane moments between the climaxes of the story. There's one in particular that I find myself returning to over and over that lies in between two of the biggest climaxes in the story. It sits right between the parting of the Red Sea as the Israelites left Egypt, left slavery, and went forth toward freedom, and standing at the mountain at Sinai getting the 10 Commandments. It's two huge climactic stories where they're singing and dancing and fearful and receiving the Torah and receiving freedom. But then they're in these first moments in between here where they're out in the desert, figuring out how the heck to be independent, free human beings in the desert. They find themselves in the wilderness, and they are most vulnerable. They're most alone. They're most unsure of what their new life is about to hold. And, I'm sorry, you might be too, and they're hungry. They're overwhelmed, and they're hungry. The food they took with them from Egypt has run out, and they are in the wilderness with no knowledge of when it's supposed to come next. So they turn to Moses and start complaining. "You brought us out here," they say. "We were supposed to just die out here of starvation. Why didn't we ever leave the slavery?" And so God has a solution. God says that bread will rain down from the sky, and thus God will give them the gift, miraculous food that will come each and every day. All they have to do is leave their tent and go get it. Much has been written about manna over the centuries, what it tasted like, what its texture was like, how it fully served their nutritional needs, so maybe that's why Cinderella, okay. But I have always been fascinated, not by the manna itself, but by this episode of how the first time the people encounter it, how they deal with it. What do they do the first time they come across it? Moses gives them the following instructions. Moses says, each head of household is to go out, gather as much of it as each of you requires to eat, and as much of each of your family members requires to eat. And they do exactly this. They go out to gather the manna. The Torah even says they do indeed gather exactly as much as each person needed. A perfect serving for every member of the family. And then Moses gives the next instruction. Let no one leave any of it over until morning. Here's the piece of the story that's always left me a little bit confused. They followed the first instruction. Every single person has the perfect amount, exactly as much of each of them is supposed to have. No less, as slaves might be used to getting, and no more. there really shouldn't be a concern about leftovers if each of them has their own perfect, miraculous serving size. But Moses anticipates leftovers and tells them not to have any. Do not leave any over. That instruction they don't follow. They don't finish it. And they do leave some over. They leave some for later. And everything that is left over ends up getting rotten, infested, malodorous, unusable. Moses is angry with them for not following his instructions. Many of the commentators answer why Moses is angry, but I find myself wondering, why did they leave it? Abraham ibn Ezra, an 11th century Spanish commentator, says it was an issue of faith. Moses told them not to leave it over, and it was a test of their faith. Did they believe that God would provide manna again the next day? Moses, says Ibn Ezra, is upset because they failed that test. They didn't expect to see it again the next day. For me, I think Ibn Ezra feels like he's looking at the situation inside Moses' head when he says that Moses is upset as the test of faith, but not the Israelites. Moses is the one who has a one-on-one relationship with God and expects the Israelites not to trust God because their relationship with God is different. It's more distant, and through him and God's miracles, except that it's through those miracles. They had just seen the plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea. Did they really doubt whether God would send more manna the next day? Their relationship with God was constant miracles. I think there was something else going on for them, something a little more individual and emotional. There seems to me that there was something in them that made them think that they didn't actually deserve the full serving that they had received. They didn't think they were worthy of all of it, so they denied themselves some of it, just to be safe. Maybe I'll need that tomorrow. Even when the Torah was abundantly clear, they each had a valid claim to everything in front of them and that there would be more. You ever done that? I know I have. Felt like I don't really deserve all of a blessing that's in front of me, even if no one else needs it, and I find myself not taking full advantage of it. What makes us do that? What makes us deny ourselves the gifts that we receive? The Mei HaShiloach, a Hasidic commentator, Rabbi Mordechai Leiner in the 19th century Poland, seems to think somewhat where I am as well. He says the Israelites' failure of faith wasn't that they didn't believe that God would provide all of them manna the next day. Indeed, they had seen the splitting of the sea and the plagues. Their failure, he says, is that they believed that God might not actually send the right amount for each of them the next day. As individuals, they each thought themselves small, disposable. God will provide for us, each thought, but maybe there won't be enough for me. I'm just one person. There are thousands of us. God will probably forget little old me. Rav Leiner concludes his teaching by saying that no person should ever believe that of God. No person should believe that he or she or they is any less in God's eye than any other person. To believe so, Rav Leiner says, would be anava pesula. This phrase is an interesting one, and one that I'd like us to explore today. Anava in Hebrew translates in English to humility. Psula, or pasul in the masculine, is an adjective that is negative. One might translate the phrase anava psula as false humility or fake humility, but I'm not sure that that's the connotation that Mei HaShiloach is going for here. Certainly not the connotation in the way that we hear the phrase false humility. That would be them pretending that they don't expect enough, but still going out and grabbing it before anyone else could. Pasul is usually used as the opposite to kosher when it comes to doing mitzvot, or objects used for doing those mitzvot. A shofar can be pasul, unfit for use on Rosh Hashanah if it's got a big hole in the side or a crack that's too big for repair. A Torah scroll could be pasula if there's mistakes in the actual handwriting of the words. A sukkah can be psula, a menorah can be psula. Basically, it means unfit, invalid. Something needs to be fixed before it can be used. So it's not so much false humility that our ancestors were experiencing, it's invalid humility. How can humility be invalid? And if we can have anava pisula, invalid humility, what is anava kshera? What is kosher humility? To answer this, I think we need to explore the feeling behind the thought of God will provide for us, but not for me. Behind that thought is when I think that many of us feel far too often, whether we're aware of it or not. Behind that thought is, I am just one person. And because I'm just one person, I don't matter. That, I think, is invalid humility. Thinking that I don't matter. Thinking that I am just one person and therefore unimportant and powerless. Perhaps humility, kosher humility, is knowing exactly how much I matter and when. Too many of us walk around life thinking we don't really matter, and it makes us do tremendous harms to ourselves and harms to others. When we think we don't matter, we don't take care of our physical selves. We become like Cinderella who didn't brush her teeth. We overeat or we undereat. We overexercise or we underexercise. We ignore signs of illness. We say we'll worry about our own health once we've worried about what everybody else around us needs. We don't take the breaks that we need to allow ourselves to recharge. We think we don't matter. We neglect our spiritual and our emotional selves. We might find ourselves falling into traps of substance or situational addiction abuse to fill holes that we leave in our own souls when we tell ourselves that we're unworthy of love because we're one unimportant person. We don't reach out to others, maybe even others who want to hear from us, because we assume that we're a burden and that we're just going to bother them. When we think we don't matter, we don't speak up when we do have the skills or the knowledge to fix a particular situation. We don't share our own strengths or talents that we've worked hard to hone because we assume there's somebody else who can do it better than I can. No one needs to hear it my way. In some ways, when we think that we don't matter, we disappear ourselves from the world. We forget that God created each of us unique and with a role for each of us to play. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, we both have him in our, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov famously said, on the day that you were born, that was the day that the Holy One decided the world could no longer exist without you. We're each supposed to use all of our own mana. To God, each of us matters. In Judaism, anava, humility, is not the simple opposite of arrogance. It does not require full self-humiliation, even if humility and humiliation might be related words in English. Anava is the spectrum between arrogance and self-deprecation. The spectrum seeks to avoid that spectrum seeks to avoid the self-damage I just listed, to remind us that our lives are precious gifts. The usual Western assumption about humility is that it means to act in a way that is totally non-boastful, and that always puts the self last. This is not what Musar, the Jewish spiritual practice of examining our personality traits, thinks. As Dr. Greg Marcus put it in his 2016 book, The Spiritual Practice of Good Actions, Musar teaches that humility in balance recognizes that sometimes it is okay to be boastful or to project oneself into a situation. In fact, sometimes it's required. In other words, humility is not that your strengths are never to be shared, just that they shouldn't lead you to think of yourself too much. Think yourself better than others. It's that you state what your talents are in order to share them, not to show them off. It's to acknowledge that you matter in the fabric of the world. It's taking up exactly the right amount of space that I am supposed to. No more and no less. In that way, it's like my serving of manna. Exactly the right amount for me. I'm to take the space that I'm supposed to, step up, and fill the role that that space and my strengths afford me. And I am only to take the space that I am meant to, so that I do not prevent another from being able to step into the space that they fill. It's not that I don't matter. It's that you do too. That's humility. I matter, and you matter. We know the dangers of arrogance and the frustration that we feel when we see others whom we perceive as thinking they matter too much. And rarely do we think that we ourselves are those arrogant ones, but that is a different sermon. The sermon is about the dangers of the self-deprecation side of the humility scale. I think our world is actually suffering from that. I think our world is currently facing a social imbalance of humility. And I actually don't think it's because we're skewing toward the arrogant side. I think it's the opposite. I think too many of us have siloed ourselves away, blocked out others who make us feel ignored, and allowed ourselves to think we don't matter in the world. We've been suffering from loneliness and depression. We think we don't matter. Reports of anxiety, depression, loneliness are at an all-time high. This leads to all of the consequences I listed earlier. And one more consequence that I don't think we might expect, just selfishness. If we think ourselves too small to be noticed, to be cared about, if we don't matter, then my actions shouldn't matter to you either. If I don't matter, then what I do doesn't matter. It's my life, it's just me, it doesn't affect anyone else. If I am certain, however misguided I might be of that certainty, that I don't matter to you, I might work harder to matter to myself, and therefore I will do whatever I need to make myself feel good and cared for and bolstered. And since I don't matter to you, I don't care if my actions do either. There's a famous story Rabbi Dennis mentioned as well last night. A group of people all in a boat, each in their own little space on the boat. And one man begins drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat. The others cry out to him, "What are you doing? You'll sink this whole ship. You'll kill all of us." The man responds to the others, saying, "What does it matter to you if I drill in my own space? I want a little water here. I'm not touching your spot. There's no hole over there. The water will come through from your space," they say, "and into ours, sinking the whole ship." The guy drilling the boat doesn't realize that he matters in the boat. When we think too little of ourselves, we forget that our actions have consequences for others. We drill our own holes because it shouldn't be their business anyway. When we think that even God will forget about little old me when tomorrow's manna is sent, we decide to forget others too. We look out for only ourselves. Maybe we'll extend it to only our tribe. Ironically, by thinking we don't matter to the world, we might actually slip back around to that arrogant and selfish side of that humility spectrum. We act only out of our own self-interests, even if it means that others will suffer. We've decided we're too small to matter to them, and darn the consequences to others. It's not my personal fault. I'm just one person. I don't matter in the grand scheme of history. That too is anava psula. The opening verse of the Torah portion, Re'eh, states, Re'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom bracha uklala. See, this day I set before you blessing and curse. The command see is in the singular, Re'eh, one person. Each of you, see. But before you, lifnechem, is in the plural. Each of us is to see that blessing and curse is presented to all of us. The Kli Yakar, a commentator who lived in Prague in the late 16th century, says that this verse teaches that each of us can tip the scales for all of us. We each matter. He spells it out further by suggesting that each time we have the opportunity to act, we should, for that moment, just for that moment, imagine that the entire world is standing at a perfect balance between good and bad. On Yom Kippur, we're taking accounts of the good things and the bad things we have done. We are supposed to pretend that that account is standing at exact zero, with the positives and the negatives exactly canceling each other out. My next deed will make all the difference in the world. I am about to choose for all of us, blessing or curse. Imagine what the world would look like if we behaved like that. I will admit it sounds really overwhelming. It seems like way too much of the world is always on my shoulders, alone. I don't think the Kli Yakar is trying to say that we each are always in that situation. I think he's trying to encourage us to behave as though we can each tip the scales. Because if we each believe that we are big enough to bring blessing to the world, together we will. Throughout our Torah, we're reminded to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. We are told to tithe our bounty, to recognize that some of what we produce, which is not the same as the gifts given in order for us to produce it, some of what we produce is to be shared. We are to be a part of a humanity that works together to choose blessing. Remember that even the most marginalized in our society matter. I asked before what anavak shera would be, kosher humility. I think it is simultaneously knowing that I am important and that I am not the center. I do matter, and my mattering doesn't negate that others matter. I have to take care of myself, treat my life as the precious gift that it is, and protect it. I have to remember also that we are connected, and that my actions affect you. In other words, it's my life, but it's not all about me. Rabbi Simcha Bunim, a Hasidic rabbi who lived in the late 18th century, gave a classic teaching, many of us may have heard it before, of how to balance these two things. He would tell his students to carry 2 slips of paper in their pockets. On one, they were to write, quoting Abraham speaking to God, "I am but dust and ashes." And they were to look at that when they found their thinking a little too self-focused and self-aggrandizing, and they needed to be reminded they were just one person, and that they did affect others. They were not the only ones who mattered. On the other piece of paper, Rav Bunim said they were to write, "The whole world was created just for me," a phrase the Talmud puts in the mouth of Adam, the first human being. And they were to look at that one when they found that they felt a little too small, when they thought too little of themselves and forgot that they did matter. It's a tricky balance to walk, and one that has been made even harder in the last year and a half when we felt more isolated and smaller and more out of control than ever. But I think we can, carrying those 2 thoughts and carrying those 2 slips, balance the 2. I matter, and you do. It's my life, and it's not all about me. It's my life. To paraphrase the great poetess Mary Oliver, it's my one wild and precious life. I must care for it. I must take care of myself. I must not think that I am too small to be cared for, that I do not deserve the full bounty of my gifts. I must use every drop of manna that God has given me, because perhaps that's the reason that I was the one to whom that drop of manna was given. And it's not all about me. I am not inferior to anyone else in God's eyes, but neither am I superior. I must remember that my actions affect others, that they may face similar struggles, and I need to be in service. I must figure out what I am to give. I must remember that my deeds can tip the scales, and others will have to live with my choices. I matter. It should simultaneously be the most affirming and most overwhelming thing I can ever tell myself. Because if I forget that I matter, I will walk with anava pesula. Instead, I should remember, I matter and you do. As we repent this Yom Kippur, may we repent all of the times that we forgot that we mattered. I repent when I forgot and I let it hurt me, and when I let it hurt you, and when I let it hurt us. I matter, you matter, we all matter. May we all be inscribed in the book of life this year. Gemar Chatima Tova. Our service will continue with the Chatzi Kaddish on page 289 of our Machzor.